As we come to our final session of the day, we turn our attention to some of the most forward-thinking research in college student mental health. This session, New Frontiers in College Mental Wellbeing Research, will feature an in-depth conversation between Dr. Sarah Lipson, principal investigator of the Healthy Minds Network, who has been shouted out many times during this program. And she is also an associate professor at Boston University School of Public Health. And Dr. John Volin, who is Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at the University of Maine, and a member of the Executive Committee of the Coalition for Transformational Education, more importantly. Dr. Lipson's work with the Healthy Mind Study, you guys come on up. Dr. Lipson's work with the Healthy Mind Study, the largest and most comprehensive research initiative on mental health in higher education, has provided critical insights into student well-being, access to care, and the systemic factors shaping mental health on our campuses. And guiding this discussion, John, who, in addition to his very busy day job, has been a key leader in the Coalition for Transformational Education's efforts to assess the impact of our member programs on student well-being. So I am delighted to introduce Sarah and John to lead us in this important discussion.
Thank you, Dana. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank again Dana and Marge and Molly and Anna and so many people that put this day together. Really fabulous work. So thank you so much. I know how much goes into try to plan something like this. And I also want to thank all the presidents in the room that have stuck through today. Presidents are always busy, but let's just say the last few weeks have been particularly busy. And so I appreciate that you are sticking with us to the end, and certainly not least, but not one of the holidays. Anyway, last but least is Sarah Lipson. I'm very excited actually to have this conversation with you, Sarah. So thank you for coming down from Boston. So you're part of the Healthy Minds study. You're like a PI now, if I remember. And there has been, I would say, at the forefront of reporting on the trends in student mental health for at least a decade now. Maybe could you tell us a little bit, what your thoughts are, kind of the few big takeaways that you've really observed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a little bit easier this year than it has been in the past because we have some positive trends to start to report on, which I think really reflect a lot of the things that are being talked about today as if they are just common knowledge, right, of a public health approach and thinking about well-being as just part of the integrated aspects of our colleges and universities. I think we're starting to see that in the population level data. There's still a lot of reasons to be very concerned, but we're for the first time since we've started collecting these data about 15 years ago, moving, it seems, in the right direction in some of these indicators. So I can highlight a few trends that we've seen over the last 15 years. When we started collecting national data in about 2009, and from about then to 2016, we saw slight increases year to year, modest increases, and then really around 2016, 2017, we started to see every year was 2 percentage points higher, which might not sound like a lot, but over 3 years to see a 6% increase in depression is of course alarming. And in 2022 is actually kind of when we saw the highest prevalence rate. So we saw depression at over 40%, anxiety just under that. Suicidal ideation went over 15%. But in the past 2 years, we've seen all three of those measures decline. So we see in our most recent data, which come from 196 schools, we had our first cohort of HBCUs participate last academic year as well. So last year we had, in terms of prevalence of depression, 38%. So still, as I said, reasons to be very concerned, but that's much lower than it had been. It reached a peak of about 44%. Anxiety at about 34%, so just over a third of students screening positive for anxiety, and about 13% of students reporting seriously considering suicide in the past year. So And we've also seen, of course, as everyone knows, increasing levels of help-seeking behavior. But really, if we, look at a chart where every year, every bar is a year of national data in Healthy Minds, the past 2 years are the first years that we see depression going down, we see anxiety going down a little bit, we see suicidal ideation going down, and we can talk about flourishing as well, but it shows the same trends where the past 2 years have been increasing levels of flourishing at a population level.
So you anticipated my question a little bit. We saw in Jean's data earlier today that the kind of leveling off, both depression and anxiety. Can you maybe take us a little bit deeper into the data? Is it just a blip, right? Because it's only like 3 or 4 years maybe,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Or is it something that you think is actually, positive and going in the right direction? And what do the data show, and what are the kind of longer term outlooks?
So I think with Healthy Minds data, we're really looking at our most recent year of data and trying to avoid projecting into the future, but we're always eagerly awaiting May and June of each academic year, being able to dive into the data and see what they look like. So last May and June, it was crossing our fingers, I just really hope that this year showed that we can start maybe thinking about this as a trend in the right direction, where, for the past 10 years, it's just been a trend in the wrong direction. Every single year has been just a little bit worse. So we would love to see that continue, of course, this year, but we won't know until May or June.
Any thoughts on why it seems to be the prevalence is going in a good direction?
Yeah, I think that this public health approach, focusing on prevention, thinking about, there's a lot of opportunities to implement best practices, a lot of missed opportunities that we still have, but I think that embracing a population level approach beyond clinical services is something we're starting to see in terms of the effects at a population level. So our data are not particularly well suited to answer the why question, which is, of course, I think the most common question, and but I think it has a lot to do with a public health approach.
So we've been talking a lot about flourishing and well-being today, and they seem to be used interchangeably. But how does that fit into the conversation, with the conversation that we've been having on mental health and perhaps this change that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I think flourishing is such an important part of this conversation because, of course, we're trying to reduce, symptoms of depression and anxiety for the students who are struggling with that, but that's not necessarily a goal that's applicable to every single student, whereas flourishing, of course, is applicable to every single student, faculty, and staff member on campus. So it really invites more of a population level approach. It also recognizes that mental health exists on a continuum, which is not a word that I heard talked about much today, but it's really acknowledging that every single person in this room, every single person at your colleges and universities is somewhere along that mental health continuum. And if we're not thinking about flourishing, we are, of course, missing a part of that continuum. It also acknowledges mental health as being dynamic. When I'm presenting our national data to student audiences, I'll usually say, over the course of 4 years in college myself, there would have been times I would have shown up on the flourishing charts, and there absolutely would have been times I would have showed up in the anxiety data as well, right? So our mental health is going to fluctuate over the course of time, and I think flourishing, recognizing that is just a really important part of understanding mental health along a continuum and recognizing that mental health is also dynamic.
I really like how you link that together. Did you guys write that down? Because I want to tap into it later. Yeah, good job, Marge. So, there is a lot of confusion about what works, to support mental health out there, and you have a room full of presidents, and we'll turn a little bit soon to, what Healthy Minds has been putting together, in the repository, et cetera. But they all want what's going to work, et cetera. And of course, it's not that easy. But what is your general advice typically?
Around identifying evidence-based interventions.
Yes.
So I guess I would start by normalizing a challenge that decision makers have, where I'm sure many of you have said, we've got momentum at our institution to be prioritizing mental health. Let's go. Let's start making some decisions about what to implement. And that question is so much harder to answer than what are the problems, what are the solutions is a much more complicated question, and practice is, due to the urgency of addressing mental health on campus, practice is so far ahead of research, and so we're just kind of trying to play catch up in a lot of ways. So I can talk a little bit about the way that we've been thinking about the evidence, which is the simplest way to talk about it is sort of like a green light, yellow light, red light metaphor, which red light, of course, is interventions that we actually know that the evidence says that they're not working particularly well. So that would include like psychoeducation on its own. We know that knowledge is pretty high actually among college students these days. Psychoeducation might be an important component of another intervention. Like in order for a mindfulness intervention to work, you need to educate people about why is this going to be something that will be impactful for you? But psychoeducation on its own is not going to work. So if we're thinking about the best investments, that's one to say if we're stopping there, we're not following what the evidence suggests. And then I can give examples as we're going on in each of these categories, but I'll just say like yellow category would be things that might have promising evidence, but not nearly enough. And that's for sure the biggest category. That's where so much of the innovation falls in. So peer programs, integrating mental health into the curriculum. I think there's a lot of data that exists out there that just hasn't been synthesized and shared in a way that can inform decision making. And then the third category would be green light, things that we know actually work. They have robust evidence and they're working. So mindfulness-based programs, means restriction for suicide prevention, skill-based training. That's another thing that I haven't heard talked about much today. We're kind of falling short in some of these efforts if we are not then giving people chances to practice their skills, like supervised skill-based training should be a part of many of the different interventions that we're thinking about.
So that's great. One thing that the network has been doing is this best practice repository, and this what works for improving mental health in higher education. Every president should download this because it gives great recommendations out of there. Mine is completely written up on, and this is a little thing, but as someone that is not in this field, but definitely cares a lot about overall student, faculty, and staff well-being. I'm struck by, one of the recommendations there is mindfulness programs that are supervised are often very consistently positive, right? But in contrast, meditation programs that are supervised are minimally. I'm sorry, but as a forester, I don't really understand that. Can you kind of help explain that for me?
I think it's probably more a reflection of the evidence base and the fact that the evidence base is a little bit further along when it comes to mindfulness and not as robust when it comes to meditation. And I think a number of the meditation interventions that have been tested have been in really like self-selecting samples of students, as opposed to ideally we would have population level data from random groups of students engaged in these interventions.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Sarah and I agreed earlier this morning, and we're going to turn this over. I know it's late in the day, but we are going to turn this over to some questions. I did want to kind of go off script just a little bit and ask, there's so much going on, in these last few weeks, and especially around DEI early on. A lot of universities, and it's not just red states, a lot of universities, cleared their websites of mention of DEI. And, the AAUP and others are talking about anticipatory obedience. Some are saying anticipatory compliance, this real reaction that's happening. But what I hear very little bit of is what is the impact on mental health of not our students, faculty, staff. And it's a little bit, you think that you're going to, one, I'd like you to discuss your thoughts on that. And two, do you think this will actually impact this progress that we've been making, overall?
I guess.
Crystal ball.
Yeah. I think the way to invite everyone into this conversation, I'm thinking about this, this semester teaching undergraduates, And the stresses and pressures that they're feeling are different from me, who, relies a lot on NIH funding. Like, they don't necessarily care that that's the big stressor that I might be bringing into the classroom on that given day. But something I like to say to them is, like, it would be impossible right now for me to be starting class and think every single person in this room is bringing their 100% attention and motivation to this moment. I am also not. I am stressed. Really kind of like normalizing that, I think. There's a fine line, of course, but I think just recognizing that everyone in their own way is being pulled in many directions in terms of stressors right now. How this current moment could affect, I think, of all the different projects that I'm involved in, I think the best practices repository, this effort to synthesize evidence, because it is so fundamentally objective, it is so based on what do the data say is going to work. I think it's a little bit protected in that regard. So I haven't been too stressed about that being in jeopardy specifically.
Good answer. Thank you. So at this point, I know it's late in the day, as I said, but and some are like this now. I understand, but this is your chance to really dig into some of the evidence base that Sarah and her team have been leading such amazing work for so long. So please, I'll open it up. Marge.
Hi. Did you? Okay. Why don't you go? You go first, then I'll follow you.
Zoe.
Hi. I asked this of the Gallup researchers at the CTE conference last year. I wonder your thoughts on you mentioned sort of the interchangeable references to flourishing and well-being and happiness and all the other words. And I wonder how that affects the ability to measure these things when we're all using slightly different words, perhaps to mean the same thing and perhaps in some cases to mean different things.
Yeah. I think that's an inherent challenge, and we're never going to get to a place where every single college and university are using the same measures, nor would that necessarily be appropriate at every school. There might be a really important reason why you're measuring flourishing in a different way. So I think the things to really think about are consistency within your own school, picking a validated measure, of course. So in Healthy Minds, we use an 8-item measure of flourishing. It measures a lot of the different domains we've been talking about, like optimism for the future, strength of social relationships, kind of life purpose and meaning. So that's one good option. It's a validated scale. So think about whether this is a strong and validated scale. Particularly in college populations or in adolescent and young adult populations. And then once you've made that decision, stick with it year after year. If you're on a cycle of collecting data every 2 years, that way you can actually compare within your institution, of course, how things are changing over time. And we've also seen, and this is evident in this room as well, increasing kind of consortiums of schools that are collecting data together. And so to make sure you're collecting the same measures as a group so that then when you're coming together to, think strategically about your plans, that you're able to be talking with the same language and with the same measures.
So my question is way less scientific, naturally. It's actually kind of a strategic question about how things work on campus. And I want to ask both of you, because you're both heavily into research, and John's in administration, you are in faculty. So
I'm still faculty, just saying.
Oh, are you? I didn't know that, John. You teach too? You do so many things. I can't keep up. No, I was struck today. We had talked to Megan about the Resilience Lab and this Be Real program, and that, as you saw from or heard from her remarks, was seated in a research center within the university. Now, it seemed to me to be, that's an incredibly great idea. And then what they do is they practice the research and then they test the research right there on their campus. It seems to me to be obviously a brilliant thing. Do you see that happens frequently? Should we be encouraging those kinds of links, and maybe it's happening and I just don't know about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, assessment, period, is the goal, right? And so there's many different forms of that, but if we think about it as a binary, are we assessing the work we're doing or we're not? We need to be assessing it in whatever ways make sense at our institution. The challenge is, I mean, with the Resilience Lab, there has been quite a bit of effort to disseminate that information, to share it, to I think as institutions of higher learning, like that's part of our mission, of course, is to be sharing best practices and scholarly knowledge. But so much of the practice that is happening, even if it's being assessed, is not being shared across campuses. So that's a big challenge in synthesizing the evidence, is that it's scattered across so many different fields, and then it's scattered and kind of held in place at all these different institutions who might be really willing to say, here's what's been working really well. I mean, we hear it here today. People are very willing to share, here's what's working at our schools, but we're all so busy and there isn't a mechanism for actually sharing that evidence more widely.
Yeah, and as you know, at the University of Maine, Marge has written on it, we have something we call research learning experiences that all students, entering students can start. We started 4 years ago, and 10% of the entering class did it. In our fourth cohort this last year, 40% of our incoming students do an authentic research learning experience. That was all developed with FATI, right? The dispositional outcomes, the cognitive outcomes, et cetera, that go into the learning outcomes of what makes a research learning experience was all done with FATI. Now we've increased it across all 4 years, so there's advanced research learning experiences, and I just put out, we just got the proposals in, and a request for proposals to all the FATI to actually study that change across 4 years of having research during that period for students, whether they enter early, et cetera, but really looking at that across. So that's just kind of, I think, a normal process. And I think it's pretty common at most universities where you really, I mean, you have the best and brightest there, right? And so you really want to be able to work together. And then at the end of the day, also, because it's not completely at all top-down, except some of the funding, because it's really a bottom-up process, and it's being developed and researched, and continually worked on to improve, iterated, it becomes owned. So, if I left tomorrow, research learning experiences are going to continue to flourish for a very long time because it's part of the culture. So, yeah, I think that's a normal process. Thanks, Marge.
I just wanted to reinforce your hypothesis, Sarah, about public health approach perhaps being the force behind the positive trends we're seeing, insofar as we just published at JED an impact report on the impact of systems change that we work with schools on student outcomes. And we take fully a public health approach, and we use the Healthy Minds data for our student data as part of our project. And we have now a large enough N to be able to report a significant reduction in depression and anxiety scores, an increase in graduation and retention rates, and a significant decrease in suicide ideation plan and attempts with the schools that have completed our program, which is, my point is, a public health approach. So I think your hypothesis that that's what's driving some of these trends, and I think a large number of our schools are the Healthy Minds population. So I think it's just reinforcing what you're saying already.
And I'll give one other term that I think we all started to know and say a lot, especially during the pandemic, was the idea of a booster. And so oftentimes, like when we're doing a training or anything kind of systematic, to think about what's the refresher that people are going to need? How can we make good on this investment by doing it repeatedly? I'll just sneak in an idea that I have that has been working really well in my department, which is we have a gatekeeper training program, and I've brought it into our faculty meetings. And so I asked my chair, can we use a portion of this time to do our BU gatekeeper training program? And so we have a captive audience of faculty all sitting there, and we've done our gatekeeper training program over a series of sessions. And there have been more hands up in the air and questions than of any other presentations that we've ever had in a faculty meeting, I would say. And importantly, from faculty, I'm quite sure would not have proactively gone and done that training. But I think, to leave you with the idea of booster sessions, that it's nothing really is just like a one-time intervention.
We have one more question.
One more
over here.
question.
Yep.
Great.
Hey, everyone. First, before my question, just want to say thanks again for everyone who organizes this and put this together, and the staff that came and are doing all the AV and everything. As an attendee, this felt very smooth. I don't know if it's like that behind the scenes, but thank you so much for everybody. Absolutely love this. Yes, thank you. My question, I'm always interested when we think about mental health across like a long period of time, how the meaning of the language changes for the people we're surveying. Anxiety doesn't mean the same as when I started my career as a psychologist to students as what it means now. And I'm kind of curious how you account for some of that in surveying populations and looking at rates of anxiety or depression, and how you capture that or account for shifts in how students even think about what those words mean, where they may not have in 2008, for example. But thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think that's why it's important that surveys and other, data collection efforts are not asking students, do you feel depressed or do you feel anxious? Maybe there's importance and meaning that you could derive from asking that, but in Healthy Minds and in a lot of the surveys that I know, of course, we're using measures that are getting at the symptoms or the risk factors for depression and anxiety, such that, and one question kind of similar to this that we often get is like, is it just because stigma's gone down and people are more aware, but we've seen measures that we wouldn't expect to be stigmatized, like loneliness or lack of belonging, or feeling stress? Those questions are showing really similar trend lines to the actual symptoms of depression that we're measuring through the PHQ-9 and symptoms of anxiety through the GAD-7. But that there's also, I think, a big role in population level data collection of having students be part of the conversation. So like we have a student advisory board, we always have several undergraduate RAs working with us, and not in the example of depression and anxiety, but in other measures, they've been like, if you ask us that, this makes us think about this other thing. And so we have shifted, not our more, clinical like screening tools, not clinical, but our screening tools we haven't shifted. But some of our other questions about like how you interact with your peers and questions around belonging and discrimination, we've listened to students who have said, actually, like that's not getting at my experience in the way that you might think it is.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I just want to say you and your colleagues at Healthy Minds are rock stars. I love the work that you're doing. So if you would, please join me in thanking you, Sarah.
Thank you, John. Thank you all. Thank you so much.